It's a pleasure to be here in Turkey, especially with such beautiful weather here on the Mediterranean. And I guess Turkey must be among the most peaceful of all the countries here in the Middle East. But you're always on the border of Europe and the Middle East. Thank you, Kamal, and the organizing committee for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be in Turkey. Our topic is a big one today, and so I'm going to jump right in. The task that I've been pursuing for some time is to try to understand what are the natural building blocks of human brain function. And this is still a bit of a mystery. We don't even understand the basis for consciousness. But I believe that recent advances in evolution, in brain imaging, as well as the description of personality, allow us to have a better model of what is the actual way that human beings are able to think. The foundation really is threefold. First, we understand more now about the structure and the dynamics of human personality. We also understand about the structure and the dynamics of thinking and thought processes. And now, together with information about the evolution or the phylogeny of the brain, we can come to a reasonable model of what the structure and function of human thought is. This is a beginning step, and I'm going to go over several different things with you. There is more detail than I can possibly give you in this one lecture, but you'll find that the references that I gave you, most of the material is published. Some new things are just coming out. It's important to understand something about well-being. And well-being refers in general to our health and our happiness. And to understand well-being, which is on this vertical axis, we have to recognize its relationship to consciousness. And we have to look at it from the point of view of evolution over our lifespan. So our health, our happiness, our well-being is at the beginning a developmental concept. And we have, as psychiatrists, as clinicians, to recognize that we all can vary from moment to moment, week to week, month to month, year to year in our state of health and well-being. We might be in a disease state. We might be addicted to drugs. We might be in an anxiety state, or even schizophrenic. And we can find that to get from this state of dysfunction to a more stable and healthier state with increased well-being, it might be nice if we could just go from here to here. But it turns out that well-being doesn't have that kind of simple dynamics. To get from one state to another, we always have to go through a dip. And it's this understanding of why a person would go from here to there by going through this that requires us to have a structure, an understanding of the structure and function of the brain and of thought. For example, if someone were an alcoholic and they wanted to give that up to be healthier and happier, we find that an alcoholic has to often hit bottom before they're able to switch to a healthier state. And so we as psychiatrists and psychopharmacologists have to understand what it is that we must supply to enable the person to move to this greater state of well-being. And this is what I call the Creative Life Project. And understanding what enables us to activate a person to expand their consciousness so that they go from a dysfunctional outlook on life to a more expanded, healthier outlook on life. That is really the core task of treatment. So how does that happen? What is it that supplies the ability for us to enlarge our consciousness, to grow healthier? This is a picture of what we might call the good life or the happy life. And you'll see that it involves a dynamic circle that I call the motor of well-being. And these three parts exist because the whole human being is not just a body. And if we try to reduce a person to the body, or to the thought, or to the spirit, then we don't have a complete picture. We have to recognize that human beings have three parts: body, thought, and psyche, or spirit, whichever you like. And we can see the advance in the level of functioning through these three parts: functioning, plasticity, and virtue. The outlook on life is a healthy one if it's a virtuous one. And by that I mean a self-transcendent outlook of unity, as opposed to an outlook of separateness. If we have an outlook of unity, then we get self-actualization, positive emotions, and engagement that lead us to function in a healthier way and allows us to be growing in awareness, letting go of fighting, and serving others, which in turn allows us to actually modify the genes that are expressed in our body so that we're able to think and feel in a different way. What distinguishes human beings from all other primates and other mammals and other animals is that we regulate our genome and we can consciously modify what genes are expressed by epigenetics. And that allows us to dominate the world, to flourish in every part of the world. If we do these kinds of practices, we modify the expression of our genome in order to grow essentially in virtue. We become, by coherence seeking, more mature and resilient. And that allows us to have virtues like hope and a capacity for courage and honor. The word virtue is sometimes negatively loaded, but I'm talking about things that really make a practical difference in our lives, like honor, courage, and hope. These are things that go beyond any one religion, that give us our capacity to live well. And that's why we call it the happy life, or the good life. Notice, though, that things go in both directions. And so you can't define well-being as only resilience, or only awareness, or only positive emotions. It involves all of these things interacting with one another dynamically. Now, how could we possibly understand this in a rigorous scientific manner? Well, I think the only thing that has sufficient scope to understand the mechanisms of health as well as the mechanisms of disease is not by categorizing people, but by understanding what motivates some people to live their life in a way that makes them healthier than others, or sometimes to not do that so well, so that we develop dysfunctions or disorders. And we can approach this scientifically with measurement by measuring personality And we can understand the underlying basis of personality, structure and function, by studying the way the human brain and our abilities have evolved throughout phylogeny. So let's begin that task. What is personality? The simplest definition is that personality is simply the way we learn and adapt. A little bit more complete description is that personality is the self, but the self plus all the things within us and outside of us that push and pull on us, that force us to adapt. My personal best definition of personality is that it's the dynamic organization within the individual of the psychobiological systems by which a person both shapes and adapts uniquely to an ever-changing internal and external environment. Now that's a long definition, but it turns out that every word in that definition is important to understand. The key feature of personality is that it's dynamic. That means that it's always adaptive, and because all of those components are interacting, we can't describe it as just a linear staircase. In fact, if you stop and think, you know this, because no matter what the beginning state of a person, they may develop into having very many different outcomes. That's what's called multifinality. And at the same time, you can begin with different personality characteristics, and that can lead to the same outcome. This is what's called equifinality. So, different things give rise to the same thing. The same thing can give rise to different things. This is the definition of what's called a nonlinear dynamic system. And yet, we try to model this with linear methods or categories, and that's simply not adequate. The second feature is that personality is psychobiological. Really, it might be better to say that it's bio, psycho, social, and spiritual. Because we have a body, we have an analytical mind. That's what I'm referring to as thought. But we also have an intuitive and creative mind that we can call mind two, or psyche, or soul. In addition, we can say that we can all communicate with each other, even if we're raised in different cultures, or we have, some people have problems and others have different problems. But there's a universal structure to human consciousness that we all share. And these are influenced by personal characteristics. But what we want to understand is not how to compare one person to another, but to understand what's going on within the person. And each person has unique experiences. So each of us is a little different from the other, even though we have so much in common that we can understand one another. So the model that I built up is one that distinguishes three aspects of our personality. The temperament, which involves our emotional characteristics that are automatic and learned by associative conditioning. Our character, which involves our goals and values and our object relationships. And this is what we learn by declarative learning or propositional learning. And then finally, there's our narrative self, which involves our understanding of ourself as having a life story with a past, a present, and a future. And human beings, when they're functioning well, are always aware of themselves as having some continuity across their life. And notice that these are always interacting with each other, and the arrows go in both directions, and that's what makes this a nonlinear process. Now, we can measure these then by first measuring the temperaments, and I've developed methods for measuring how prone we are to anxiety, which I call harm avoidance, how easily we lose our temper and seek rewards and novelty seeking, how sociable and warm we are, which I call reward dependence, how strongly we form social attachment, and finally, how ambitious and determined we are, which allows us to keep going even when we get frustrated. And in addition, we can measure our character by how self-directed we are, how cooperative, and how transcendent. And I'll describe those briefly. But notice that our emotions influence our character because they determine what we notice. But then our character, our goals and our values influence our emotional state because of the meaning that we assign to things. And in turn, you'll see that there are bidirectional arrows connecting these, so that a human being is always something in flux. We're never fixed. So, how do we recognize these traits? These are descriptions of the basic temperaments. Harm avoidance, when it's very high, involves being anxious and leads to the internalizing disorders, or cluster C, personality disorders. High novelty seeking makes us impulsive and irritable, and we often refer to those as the cluster B, personality disorders. Reward dependence makes us warm and sociable, sensitive to rejection. And if that's low, we're cold and aloof rather than sociable and warm. And we call being low in this cluster A disorders. But the problem with the DSM system is that even the clusters overlap, because you can have all of these in combination with one another. And then the fourth system, persistence, involves us being ambitious and persevering, but also sometimes perfectionistic. And that leads to obsessive traits. So I don't know if you've classified yourself yet, but one of the best ways to try to do this is to try to think about your friends and your enemies and see how you would describe them. For example, if you're high in novelty seeking and you're high in harm avoidance, but you're low in reward dependence, that would put you here. All of these are labels for different combinations of the three where they're all high in novelty seeking. These are low in novelty seeking. The ones in the front are all high in harm avoidance. The ones at the back are low in harm avoidance. These are the ones that are high in reward dependence. So you notice that if you're prone to anxiety and prone to anger, and you're not very good at reading social cues, that would tend to put you at a disadvantage. And many of these people we describe as having borderline personality disorders. But every one of these could be mature. One of the things that I discovered after I developed the temperament, the tridimensional personality questionnaire that measured only the temperaments, was that every one of these temperaments is neither good nor bad. They have advantages and disadvantages. And so the combination that you have just describes your emotional style. And it may make you more or less, it may give you more or less challenges to adapt in different situations. For example, if I want to get my accounting done, I generally go to someone like this rather than someone like this or this. But if I wanted someone to be an adventurer or an explorer, I'd be more likely to select someone with these personality traits. So everybody has some adaptive niche. What is it that makes some people more mature than others? It's not your emotional style. It's the way you govern and regulate your emotions. And that's described in terms of the 3 branches of government. Your mental self-government, your executive branch of that, is to be self-directed, responsible, purposeful, and resourceful. But in addition, a good government also needs a legislative branch that makes the rules that allow you to get along with others. And that's cooperativeness, being flexible, helpful, and forgiving. But even if you've got a good legislature and executive branch, you have to know when the rules apply. And that's self-transcendence, which allows you to be intuitively judicious and to know when the rules apply. So I'll leave it to you to decide how well we're doing these days electing and having governments that are serving us well. But we can certainly work on our own mental self-government, and perhaps then we'll be more successful in getting good state governments. Let's look at the style that arises from those 3 branches of government. For example, this is what I call the character cube, and on the back cube here we have everybody that's highly self-directed. And then over here on this side, we have everybody that's highly cooperative. And on the top, we have everybody that's highly self-transcendent. So if we wanted to find a dysfunctional government, we would look to being low on all 3 of those. And that would be being low in self-directedness, so that the person never takes responsibility. Low in cooperativeness, so that they think everybody's mean and not so you can't trust them. And low in self-transcendence, so that there's no feeling of connectedness to them. So just think if you felt that life was hard, that's low. People are mean, and then you die, that would be the downcast or depressive position. Nobody laughs, so I'm not sure the translation is going. Did you get that? Life is hard, people are mean, and then you die. That's a description that would make anybody depressed. The opposite would be to be in this creative mode where challenges are seen as opportunities to learn more. People being difficult is an opportunity for you to be empathic and forgiving. And obstacles that seem to frustrate us are an opportunity for us to learn how to identify even in the face of misfortune. And so if you can maintain that kind of unified perspective, this leads to health and happiness. This also works pretty well, as I'll show you data later. So what's happened in the development of this approach is that first I developed only the temperament scales, assuming that I could reduce everything to these heritable temperament traits. But it turned out that although I could describe the subtypes of personality disorders well, it did not tell me whether or not people were mature. And so I had to develop the character scales, which focused on mental self-government. And this then allowed me to describe whether or not someone had a personality disorder and how severe it might be. But it still did not tell me whether or not someone was likely to change toward getting greater well-being. And so I had to move to this third level of focusing on the dynamics of self-aware thought using an evolutionary perspective, which I'll describe to you now. Because this is important, in fact crucial, to understand what the underlying structure is that allows us to rapidly adapt and to succeed as human beings. That's because we have this process going on where these are always interacting with each other. And I'll let you just glance at that for a moment. The narrative self looks at things in a positive way when we're using humor or feeling engaged. This allows us to change our feelings, which in turn allows us to direct our character. And we develop conscious goals that allow us to actually essentially write a new chapter in our life story as it evolves. So personality is a dynamic system with self-directed emergent properties, and the effects are simultaneously top-down and bottom-up, so that the only way we can understand that is to study the whole person as a nested network of interactive relationships. And that's the same phenomenon that we have to look at in evolution, because if you wanted to design a human being to do the things that we do, you probably wouldn't force people to go through all of the evolutionary steps that we have. But in evolution, each step has to operate successfully in order for the animal to live. And so we can understand the way our brain has been organized and the way it functions by understanding what the evolutionary steps have been that led to our human brain. This is a picture of what's Paul McCune's idea of the triune brain. A reptilian brain surrounded by an old mammalian brain and then the new mammalian brain. And I think he was very close to an important insight. And that is that human beings don't have one system of learning and memory. We have three major systems of learning and memory. We have a habit system that is well developed actually in reptiles. And then on top of that, we developed a capacity for emotion in mammals, actually in monkeys. And then in humans, we developed a capacity for self-aware thinking. And so we have to understand both temperament, or the habit system, declarative learning, which is the mammalian or monkey brain, and the human brain, which allows us to develop language, art, science, and spirituality. And all three of those aspects have to communicate and interact in the person. And so we can define the components of our functioning brain by understanding the way these three systems have developed and how they communicate with each other. So let's begin by a quick review of just what the evolutionary sequence was that led to human beings, what are the functions that emerged in that animal, and what are the brain structures that evolved. So what you'll see is that I was able to define what are the ancestors of human beings based on molecular phylogenetics. We're able to study the functional abilities by detailed work by biologists, anthropologists, and others. And we can study the nature of what brain systems emerged when these functions emerged by looking at comparative neuroanatomy. So what I'm doing is linking three broad systems of literature so that we can get an understanding of the relationship of function to structure. Now, the earliest animals, like the lamprey eel and jawless fish, already had paired sensory organs in the head, so that in addition to having a skull and neural crest, they had a peripheral nervous system, endocrine system, and paired sensory organs in the head. And then in the earliest vertebrates, the fish and the amphibians, we see that they've already got all the cranial nerves present, and the midbrain is the dominant central integrator of behavior. And in these animals, associative conditioning is already well developed. When we moved onto land, when we moved out of the water and onto the land at amniotes, we were able then to breathe oxygen on land, The amnion protected the fetus from drying out. And what happened here was, instead of the midbrain being the central integrator, it was now the hypothalamus. And that has some major implications. But let me just show you a picture. This is a picture of these earliest craniates, the lamprey. And you see this area in red is the midbrain. And then this line that goes across here separates the midbrain from the forebrain. And what you see is that in the earliest fish and frogs and lizards, it's still the midbrain that's the dominant structure. And it's only when we go beyond the reptile brain, the lizard brain, that the forebrain becomes larger. This is a picture of the evolution of amniotes. That includes reptiles and birds and all the mammals. And you see it's a very long evolutionary history. Over 300 million years ago, the amniotes started to diverge. And before this happened, I'll tell you in advance that there was a major extinction event at this point. And whatever happens whenever there's a major extinction event is that the dominant life forms are wiped out, and then some new life forms take over to solve some problems that led to the extinction of the earlier one. And then we get a divergence between these lines that lead to the reptiles and birds and those that led to all the mammals. That happened at another major extinction event that basically occurred right here at the end of what's called the Paleozoic. That led to this divergence. Then later there was another divergence about 200 million years ago that led to some differentiation in the mammals. And you'll see that we have the monotremes, which are the most primitive, the marsupials, and then the true mammals like the rat and mouse, dogs, everything else. This is the point where the famous KT event, where a giant meteorite hit the Yucatan, and it was thought for a long time that that created so much dust that it wiped out the dinosaurs. That may not be the case, but it is events around that time led to the proliferation of all the true mammals. Now, the story of the differentiation of mammals is the one that most concerns us, because it's what tells us what led to the structure of human consciousness. The anteaters, the spanny eyeaters, are a good example of those monotremes, the most simple of these animals. The spanny eyeater, believe it or not, an ancestor very remotely, or at least we have common ancestors with the spanny eyeater, basically are the animals that show the first intentional control of sex drive in response to tactile stimuli. And these animals will circle a female when the female is ready for months, losing most of their body weight in order to have a chance to reproduce. And they do that intentionally rather than just reflexively like reptiles do. But this is not a very adaptive mechanism. The brains of these animals are very undifferentiated. They have there's no differentiation even between sensory and motor neurons in the forebrain. So very primitive. They do have sensation. They have all the senses, remember, but they don't even have specialized neurons for motor functions and sensory functions. This little creature, the pin-tailed tree shrew, is we have a common ancestor with this animal. Notice it's about the size of a mouse. This is one of the early true mammals. And this is the animal that is thought to be the common ancestor of all the primates. These animals, about the size of a mouse, live in trees. And all they can eat are insects. And they live in pairs because a tree generally only has enough insects to feed a pair. And you've got to have a pair to reproduce. But if another pair of tree shrews starts to invade the territory of these, it's a life-threatening situation because they're very marginally able to get enough food in order to sustain themselves and reproduce. And if others come into their territory, their very survival is threatened. And so they're extremely territorial, and they become very aggressive. So these animals are our best model for both anxiety and aggression. And they don't do much else but eat, reproduce, and when threatened, get anxious and attack. So just think about a human being when they're in a state of agitation or violence. And think of them as a little tree shrew. Because what's happening is that they're regressing so that they're not utilizing other systems that have evolved to do better than the tree shrew can do. Now, this is basically the story of these animals, and I'll skip time. So the problem that those animals had was they had to find a way to be able to digest more food, more varied diets, and they needed to be able to grasp that food and consume it. So what happened in the next step of evolution, leading to humans, was that we developed these protoprimates emerged. Because at about the time that they had to solve this problem in evolution, flowering trees were evolving at the same time. So animals and plants always co-evolve. We don't emerge in a vacuum. And with the fruits becoming available, it was very handy, to make a pun, I don't know if that translates into Turkish, it was very useful for them to be able to grasp the fruit that was usually at the end of branches. But to do that, they also had to be able to coordinate reaching. And so parts of the brain like that in the area that we call Brokaw's area now evolved to enable people to become more agile in grasping fruit and to hold on to the tree so that you didn't fall out of it at the same time. And in addition, our GI tracts had to evolve to enable that digestion. So the earliest protoprimates, like this creature, developed both physical agility and better ability to digest. And that gave rise to all the other true primates, like this lemur. But the lemurs and the early primates were solitary nocturnal animals. There are some social forms of these early wet-nosed primates. But basically, most of these, and the earliest ancestor of humans, is thought to have not only been wet-nosed, but to be nocturnal and solitary. So they may look cuddly, but they're not emotional creatures. They don't socialize except to reproduce. The next step in evolution occurs in monkeys, where there was changes in the climate so that monkeys had to be operating during the day in order to get enough food and light to stay warm. And what happened at this point is we developed the parts of the brain that enabled us to support emotional experiences. And we became social diurnal animals rather than asocial nocturnal animals. And so the monkeys developed a capacity for attachment, just like John Bowlby used the rhesus monkey as the model for human attachment, because at the emotional level, our attachments are just like those of monkeys. We do some things better than that, but emotions are very much like that of a monkey. And when two monkeys get into a fight, this is a picture of the alpha mother telling the little children to kiss and make up. And here you see a picture of alpha male being kissed by a female who made the mistake of hitting the alpha male, but rather than get beat up, decided to kiss and make up. And this is what monkeys and apes do, is that they have a sensitivity to conflict that means that they're uncomfortable if there's social tension. Because for monkeys to survive, they eat and search for food in troops. And it's the social unit that is stable that allows them protection from predators. In addition, in order to be able to read social cues and to get along in groups, the chimps had to get smarter. And the monkeys got smarter. And you can see that monkeys are able to transmit traditions from one from one generation to the next. This is a picture of a Japanese monkey, a Japanese macaque, who has learned to wash the dirt off of food, which does two things. It gets rid of the dirt and it also puts a little salt on it, makes it tastier. And these monkeys have now passed that tradition on for more than 6 generations. And so if you think that culture is something that is uniquely human, think again, because in fact, traditions at least can be transmitted between generations in monkeys and in apes. Now, at the next step occurred with the bipedal apes, or the Australopithecus. This is a picture of the famous Lucy. You may not think she's too attractive, but 3 to 4 million years ago, she was the dominant life form at this point, able to stand up and walk. We know that from footprints that were preserved in volcanic ash and then fossilized in Africa. And what happened here, notice the brain is not very big. I'll show you a picture of the skull case in a minute. I think this actually may give her a little bit bigger brain than she deserves. Because here, take a look. This is 6 million years ago. This is Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, 3.9 million years ago. And you can see this is her brain. And then these are some forms that really are the first Homo, members of the genus Homo. That's about 2 million years ago. And then 1.8 actually. And then we have Homo erectus. And then about 800,000 years ago, Homo heidelbergensis. And then we have Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon man. But look at the skull casings to get a more clear idea. This is a orangutan. This is Australopithecus africanus. See why I said the picture gave a little bit too much credit? And then this is the modern human brain. Cro-Magnon man, not much difference. All of these fairly similar. This is Homo ergaster, which I'll show you a picture of. That's 1.8 million years ago. There's been a little fleshing out, but still already a huge difference there. So this is a picture of a Australopithecus. Notice these flared rib cages. This is Homo sapiens. And then this is Homo ergaster, or Turkana from 1.8 million years ago. These are very similar and very different from this Australopithecus. This is the lineage that is probably most accepted among most evolutionary biologists for humans. The various Australopithecus gave rise to Homo ergaster. That's the 1.8 million years ago. And then next big transition is Homo heidelbergensis. And then we have various Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. Notice that they're simultaneous with the emerging brain. There's also development of what they call the culture as recognized by the different complexities in tool making. I'll show you a little bit more about that. But notice that the early Homo sapiens, the emergent function is tool making with refined gesture and vocalization and the ability to walk long distances efficiently. These were not the smartest of people in any way, but they were very good at walking. And what happens in Homo is that in order for the brain to get bigger, the skull can't get much bigger, and so what we get is hemispheric specialization and asymmetry, especially around the parts that support language. And then in the mid-Pleistocene, 800 million years ago, No, that's right. 800,000 years ago. We get the emergence of real craftsmanship, long-term planning, fire, building shelters, and so on. And this is associated with the increasing size of the prefrontal and the parietal areas for problem solving and planning, and the default mode network. This is an example of huts with a hearth that goes back as far as 400,000 years ago. And this is the evolution of tool making. These are flints. This is that of Homo habilis, the earliest Homo. Brain of about 600 cc's. Homo erectus and Homo ergaster had brains of about 1,000 cc's. And then Neanderthal man is actually a little larger than 1,300 cc's. So this is a picture of Cro-Magnon man, our ancestor, and Neanderthal. Notice again these flared ribs. And there's also a different configuration in the hip, so that's what allows Homo ergaster and Homo sapiens and Homo Cro-Magnon man to be efficient walkers and runners. Now, the evidence for modern humans to be able to theorize is first documented by this stone, this bone, that shows 30,000 years ago somebody clever enough to actually track the lunar cycles and to show the different size of the moon having a recurring pattern. Around the same time that kind of scientific thinking and ability to track things over time were occurring, we saw the emergence of remarkable art in the caves in southern France and in other parts of the world. But this is now thought to have been not just artistic, but to also have been symbolic for spiritual and mystical rites. So we see art and science and spirituality and burying the dead with very complicated artifacts as showing an awareness of things that we can't see. And the major difference between chimps and humans is that chimps can reason about things that are in front of them, but they can't reason about things that are out of sight. Whereas humans are able to keep things in memory and think about what is not observable at a theoretical level, which allows us to develop syntactical language, art, science, and spirituality. So if we take that very rapid review of evolution, you can see what has happened in mammals is at first we had the development of mating, which gave us voluntary control of sex drive and foraging, and that involved the development of neocortex that regulated sexuality. The next step in the early primates and proto-primates was the development of the physical agility. Remember the animals reaching for the fruit at the end of trees and holding on for dear life with their toes, giving us agility, sensory discrimination, and that's when we had the differentiation of sensory motor cortex and the regulation of the cortex, not by touch as for sexuality, but for taste. And then in monkeys, we got the development of the limbic system and certain other neurons that allow rapid communication between the anterior insular cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex with a mirror neuron system. And this gives us a capacity for regulation of mood, but also a vulnerability to mood disorders. And these are the kinds of phenomena that emerge with the development of the limbic system. And then the fourth step in early Homo is the development of meaning with the differentiation of the auditory cortex with cross-modal symbolism. And that allowed us to plan, develop handicraft, tool making, and gesture. But there's still no language at the level of with syntax. You could still make sounds. You could represent things. You could gesture about it. You could have cultural traditions, but monkeys had that as well. And yet, what you see here is the development of this symbolic ability, but all of these early hominids have gone extinct because the modern Homo sapiens, in addition to having meaning, also has the ability to perceive things as a unity. With our self-aware learning system that connects the frontal, temporal, parietal cortices by projections from the visual system that allow us to orchestrate the whole brain with a sense of harmony. And that gave rise to these other functions. So we can look at this then as 5 major steps in the evolution of mammals: mating, physicality, mood, meaning, and unity. But remember, these are all operating in human beings. And they're all had to be operating as they went. In other words, we didn't give up sex, and we didn't give up power, we didn't give up emotions when we evolved intellectual and spiritual functioning. So what happens is you begin in those tree shrews with regulation there. And then when we move on to the early primates, we got the ability for maternal care, parenting, physicality, and the seeking of taking risks and gratification. Then when we got to monkeys, we not only added the sensitivity to mood, but also attachment, traditions, ability to sing, sensuality, and seduction, all of which you see in monkeys and apes. And then in the early humans, as far as we can reconstruct, in addition to getting meaning, we got planning, handicraft, sharing. Pairs would meet, would work together, and then groups would form around those mated pairs, and they could protect the weak and the sick, so that the early humans were able to migrate throughout the whole world. Gesture, leadership, sense of community that allowed these small communities to function. All of these built up based on the interactions. And then finally, with the capacity to orchestrate the whole brain as one, we got all of these other features: moderation, spontaneity, altruism, dialogue, diplomacy, humor, charity, trust. So these are the steps, and I will leave you the details to some of the publications that I have that give you, but this is sort of a big picture of what the component parts are. And this is the way we can measure it with the temperament and character inventory, because harm avoidance involves the regulation of these features, novelty seeking these, reward dependence these, persistence here, self-directedness here, self-cooperativeness here, and then all of this is self-transcendence. And so this is basically the evolutionary background for the traits that I developed and described on the basis of learning experiments and genetic structure in humans. But because people always argue that there are alternative structures, I had to go to something that had sufficient power to document that these are the actual natural units based on the evolution of these abilities. So what does that translate into in terms of how do we understand then what makes people healthy and happy and well? This is a picture of a study that I did, first study that I did predicting well-being with personality traits. This is about 1,000 people in the greater St. Louis area in the United States. And we measured their 3 character traits. This is little s means low self-directedness, little c means low cooperativeness, and little t means low self-transcendence. Notice that these individuals have a big blue bar. That means they were mostly depressed. Life is hard, people are mean, and then you die. That was their worldview. Whereas over here, we have people who are mostly happy, and they turned out to be the ones that were high in all 3 of the character traits. If you're average in the character traits, you're just average in your vulnerability to sadness and your possibility for happiness. We've subsequently done similar studies in other countries. This is a study in Israel that we just completed, in which We again looked at about 2,000 individuals living in Israel, which is a kind of a rough place to live in right now with all the conflict with the neighboring countries. And you can see that we get the same picture. If you're high in all three of the character traits, you're healthy. And now we're looking at health not only in terms of mood, but also in terms of physical health and social well-being and emotional well-being. And the ones that are the least healthy, that have the most heart attacks, the most cancer, the most hypertension, the most arthritis, you name it, they've got it. Life is hard, people are mean, and then you die. So your attitude, your mental attitude, affects your emotional functioning, your social functioning, and your health in general. We can't separate body, thought, or spirit. Now, how is that working? What is actually happening? Let me illustrate for you this last step in human evolution that distinguishes us from other primates. This is a simplified picture of the human brain. This is prefrontal cortex. This area is Brodmann area 10, which is called the anterior prefrontal cortex, or the frontal poles, right here. In order to activate that, this is a lovely study done by Mall in Brazil, where he got people to make charitable donations. They had money, they had the opportunity to donate it or to keep it, and some people decided to give it away. And when they did that, they activated their anterior prefrontal cortex. And the correlation there was almost 0.9 with the activation of the anterior frontal cortex, because even though they were making a sacrifice personally, they identified with the organization to which they were giving it, and so they felt pleasure and satisfaction from making a sacrifice. The same thing occurs when someone is doing improvisation with jazz, or when they're doing something that's not exploitative, but is allowing them to increase their understanding. So whenever we're exploring, improvising, or multitasking, or being charitable and kind, we feel engagement, unity, and connectedness, and that activates the anterior prefrontal cortex. So it's that part of the brain that is the most recently evolved part of the brain, that's the last to myelinate, and that is the most important for achieving harmony throughout the entire brain, left and right. So with that in mind, as just an example, that yes, there is a link between the parts of the brain that get activated whenever we're orchestrating in a harmonious way that leads to well-being. Let's now think about what is our current evolutionary position, because there's a famous definition of human beings as humans are evolution conscious of itself. I'll repeat that. Human beings are evolution conscious of itself. So let's be humans for a moment and be conscious of what position we're at right now in evolution. Let's look back first, and this is a picture of the 5 prior mass extinction events that have occurred in the world history. There was one way back almost 400,000 years ago in the Ordovician. 50% of animal families were wiped out. And then later, 30% of families were wiped out. And then here, when that big divergence between what led to birds and what led to mammals occurred, 60% of animal families were wiped out. So we have 5 past events. One of the things that's interesting about these is that people have proposed various things that might have explained them. But the one thing that they all have in common is that there was a rapid increase in atmospheric CO2 at each of these extinction points. Very nice paper about that. Now, the situation we're in now is that we seem to be in or about to hit the sixth great mass extinction event in world history. Already about a third of all the animal species are threatened. And it's expected that if we don't change the way we're living, that about half of all species will be lost in our lifetime within the next 20 years. And that's coincident with rising CO2 from the industrial activity, which is an unsustainable threat. Now, I don't want to be alarmist because it turns out that the level that we're at now is only about 380 parts per million. And all the other extinction events that I'm talking about were over 1,000 parts per million. But we're moving in that direction rapidly. So we have a little bit of wiggle time, not much. So let's just look at what is happening. Climate change, the earth is warming, ice caps are melting. As I said, we're on the verge of wiping out half of all the species of plants and animals on earth. We have an economic crisis that I think all countries are quite aware of around the world. We have an energy crisis with shrinking supplies of oil and so on. Our arable land is only 10%, and much of that is being exceeded now that we've gone from 2.5 billion people in the world in 1944 to 7 billion people today. Global food and water crisis. Already we have 1 billion people that are hungry and starving, and the water demands will exceed the supply by 2020. We have a mineral crisis in that we have limited numbers of precious metals, and these are concentrated unequally, like a lot of them are still in China, and China may not be willing to share. So we have a number of problems with the way we're going about things competitively. And the question is, are we going to continue on the path we're on? Or are we going to step back and look at what history tells us? Are we going to be human beings conscious of evolution and the unique position we're in? Or are we going to continue acting as we have in the past? So what do? I was asked to talk about the psychobiological projects, targets for well-being. But you see, I can't just talk about drug development because drugs alone are not sufficient. The pharmacological targets are primarily going to be related to the temperament dimensions, ways to reduce fear, anger, hypersensitivity, and cognitive distortion. And these agents can be very helpful to facilitate a state of mind that allows us to promote well-being. We have to calm the limbic brain in order to be able to utilize the prefrontal cortex in order to think rationally and to plan ahead with self-awareness. The development of self-awareness is what allows us to be conscious of evolution itself. And so the plasticity of modern humans puts us in a paradoxical situation because it's our ability to adapt to every part of the world that has allowed us to dominate the whole world and to now produce 7 billion people that essentially are defining a new age, the Anthropocene. And so we're now having to recognize that we need to change our outlook and the way of living in order to be able to not destroy humanity. So to do this, I work with a nonprofit foundation that has developed a number of materials distributing the temperament and character inventory. We also have developed things that are psychoeducational tools to teach people techniques for living. We also have some things that allow people to just have fun, watch music that's interesting and stimulating. And then we're also providing professional development for what we call well-being coaches and coherence therapy. So if you want to know more about that, you can look at that online. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this comprehensive talk. And we can proceed to questions. If there is anybody to ask questions, please do not hesitate. Sorular varsa lütfen Hoca hazır buradayken, yanı başımızdayken. Oğuz.
Teşekkür ediyorum. Benim sorum bilhassa bu karbondioksit tehdidiyle ilgili. Okay, I can ask the question in English and then they can translate it to Turkish then.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I think I can hear it now.
Okay. Benim sorum karbondioksit tehdidiyle ilgili. Karbondioksit artışının bir taraftan da esasında oluşturduğu partiküllerle dünyaya inen işte güneş ışınlarını azaltarak bir taraftan da dolaylı yolla esasında soğumaya yol açtı. Yani son zamanlardaki tartışmalardan bir tanesi. Ve dolayısıyla esasında ana tehdidin karbondioksit soğumasının olmadığı, ısınmasının olmadığı, esasında doğal gaz ya da başka bir enerji kullansak da işte bu partiküllerle düzelme olduğu için esasında mesela kömürle ya da doğal gaz arasında bile çok büyük fark olmadığı anlamıyor galiba.
Now I can.
Oğuz, bence sence İngilizce sor, daha şey olur. Verimli olacak herhalde.
I didn't hear the question in English.
Okay, I can ask the question in English and then they
Okay.
can translate to
They
Turkish.
had it on the wrong number.
For the threat of carbon dioxide, do you,
Yeah.
okay, they say there is the other side of the coin. They say if when these particles are in the atmosphere, they stopped coming down of the solar radiations. So by that, they also, not increase the warmth, but they kind of decrease the warmth coming from the sun. And so we should not be worried about this much. In the slide you showed that this is mainly related to carbon dioxide. So, but this other group, which is having a lot of publications since last 2 or 3 years, they say that, we have to see both sides and we should find some other solutions to the problem. So what do you think of this, and what do you think that the increase of carbon dioxide and the size of the brain, you think there would be any relationship?
Well, let's just talk about the first part. It turns out that with increasing CO2, most of the data does show that there's an increase in temperature. Because what happens is that it's like a greenhouse, and the heat can't dissipate. And so I don't think you really do get a screening out of the heat from the sun. You get a greenhouse effect that makes the heat build up. At least that's what the scientific consensus is by the UN IPPT committee. I think a lot of the arguments are, I'm not an expert in that part, and I don't claim to be speaking authoritatively, but the data that I see there suggests that, in fact, we do need to look at the fact that we are altering climate, whatever it is that we're doing with industrialization. And it's very clear that there is an increase in CO2 and core samples, and that this is a threat to us around the world with the acidification of the ocean and the increasing temperature. We're going to have serious problems from that. Now, whether there's a relationship between CO2 and the increasing size of the brain, that's not been shown. What's been shown is that there was variation within a relatively small range that did shift animals from being nocturnal to diurnal, and there was increasing brain size in response to that. But the CO2 challenge is a different one right now. I don't think that CO2 is a trigger for evolution. I think it's a challenge to our survival.
Okay. Professor Doksat.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I'm talking in English, okay? It's easier, I think.
Yeah.
As Desmond Morris once said, we are the lost chain between the real humans and the animals. Because evolution never stops. It's per se so because we see that every time evolution is stopped, for example, 8 great hitting from the outside of the space, in 5 of them, 99% of all living organisms were dead, and every time evolution began, and it was much more spread. So we human beings are also, I don't know, we'll see it, but going somewhere. So I think evolution has, as you use very good words of psyche and soul and spirit, I like them also. I think evolution has a teleology. So what do you think in coming 500 or 5,000 or 100 million
For
years?
humans?
What shall we gonna be? And
What will we be? The amount of change in humans right now in the body is very minimal. And we've seen increases and decreases in how civilized the world was since we've had recorded history. And I think what we see are phases of Renaissance and Enlightenment and dark periods. And I think we're in a dark period right now. And I think we've shown that we've been able to get out of dark periods before, and that we have a great capacity for that adaptation. But we now are in a dark period, and we're being presented with challenges. And so we have to ascertain what are the facts. There's a lot of deception. There's a lot of distortion. People who want things to continue as they have put out a lot of disinformation. I mean, it's very hard, for example, if we just look at what's going on here in the Middle East, to know what's the truth of what's happening in Syria and Egypt. We look at the United States, and I won't criticize Turkey, but I can criticize the United States. Look at how we are bullying and how we are trying. We support the military in Egypt, but we're destabilizing Syria, where when I visited there, the people were actually fairly comfortable with Assad, even though he's a tyrant. So it's not clear that we actually are practicing what we preach in the United States, that we're doing a lot of things that are deceptive and hypocritical for power and for control of resources. And this is exactly what happens whenever you get an outlook of separateness and you want to operate through competition and domination and military force, rather than through harmony and peace and cooperation. And so I think we have practices that are not healthy. We're more fanatical and tyrannical, like the self-directed but uncooperative and untranscendent personal character. So I see us as paranoid. And that's common for many governments around the world right now.
İki sorumuz daha var. Fakat 3 soru daha var. Bir tam yerine gelmişken ben izninizle bir soru sormak istiyorum. My question is, Professor Cloninger, in English. You talked about how United States is doing some misdeeds in the world. In one slide, I read that there are plenty of animals and there is help us. I read that slide like help United States. In the fashion that we should help United States to help to tame itself, to limit itself, and to limit itself in harming the world. Probably we should help United States to increase the harm avoidance and decrease the novelty seeking, because 90% of the carbon dioxide emission is from United States and it's not treating the Kyoto Protocol. So I think what we have today is an ailment of the modern mind indeed, which is not contributed by many parts of the world. This is not a shared human misery. This is a misery created by so-called masters to the rest of the world. What would you comment on that? What would you say about that?
I don't disagree, actually. I think that the United States is responsible for much of the pollution and excessive consumption. And the problem is that now, with other places like China and India developing themselves in a similar pattern, they want to do it too. And so now we're starting to complain, but we haven't practiced that. And so you're right, the whole world needs to practice restraint, because we actually can't afford for India and China to do what the United States has done, and the United States can't continue either. But because we haven't set a good model, it's very hard then to tell others that they should forego and sacrifice for us. And it's just not possible. So we have to come up with a global solution.
Yeah.
But we are being divided and destabilized by deceptive information.
Thank you. Çok kısa sorularımızı sorabilirsek lütfen buyurun.
Hi.
I hope the State Department isn't taping me.
So I want to ask a question about the temperament dimensions. When we talk about low reward dependence, does it correspond to only low social attachment, or is this a more general kind of problem which includes a decision-making problem? I mean, not to take the necessary feedback from the previous experiences, and so can we see it in a more kind of decision-making problem, or is it just a social context?
No, it's a very good question about reward dependence. When I originally formulated it, it was meant to be an index of the ability to form conditioned signals of reward. And it turned out that the best items for measuring that reliably were social cues. And so most of the items are really about social cue formation. But when this has been studied, it actually does give information not only about social reward, but about conditioned signals of reward in general. But it's just that for us, conditioned signals are often social, and so that is a very good way to measure it. But I think that it certainly should be able to predict, for example, if it's high, a sensitivity to gambling or other addictions. Because you form these conditioned signals of reward, and it may not be a face that reminds you, or a friend, an associate that you smoke or gamble with, but just what it feels like to walk in a particular gambling hall. You know, it's very hard for people to develop new habits in old surroundings. And I think this is because of high reward dependence. There's a little bit of data about that published by Philip Corr, C-O-R-R. But there's much more need for research on that topic.
Akif, arkada bir arkadaşımız daha var.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is, which one is a further step in evolution, in your idea, rationality or spirituality?
What was the
Which one is a further step in evolution, rationality or spirituality, and why?
Yeah, the first step, the ability to do planning to make tools, to make huts, to regulate fire, was done by early hominids who did not bury their dead, did not have a sense of art or anything that looks like syntax. And so symbolism and meaning, tool making, culture, communities, they emerged before spirituality. And then you only get, that occurs, 2 million years ago in early hominids. And then we get art, science, and spirituality together no more than about 150,000 years ago. And so that step that involves syntactical language and spirituality is more advanced. Now, it isn't that I would say that being reasonable is better than is not as good as being spiritual. What I would say is that real spirituality that is based on the capacity to look back, look at the present, look at the future, and to then plan in a coordinated way. And that involves automatic kinds of intuitive intelligence that is more efficient than having to analyze a lot of details. And so it has allowed us to displace the early humans. I've got it.
Thank you.
Evet, buyurun lütfen.
Sorumu Türkçe sorabilir miyim acaba?
Tabii, lütfen.
Which one?
Sayın Kloninger, bize kişiliği tanımını yaptınız, yapısını anlattınız. Bunu kişiliğin, davranımın beyin fonksiyonları, beyin yapısıyla ilişkili olduğunu anlattınız. Bunu tabii öncüllerimizden başlayarak işte kişilik, davranış ile beyin fonksiyonları, beyin yapısı arasında ilişki kurdunuz. Çok güzel bir sunum yaptınız. Teşekkür ederim. Benim merak ettiğim şey şu. Şimdi en son kişilik olarak bizi öncüllerimizden ayıran şeyin unity, self-awareness, Türkçe çevirecek olursak farkındalık ve işte bütünlük, spirituality, bunu bizi gelişmiş kılan şeyler olduğunu söylediniz. Öte yandan beyin yapılarını da anlatırken beynimizin daha kompleks, daha böyle birbiriyle bağlantılı ve ayrıyeten prefrontal korteksten bahsettiniz. Merak ettiğim şey şu, bir iki örnekte altruistik birkaç davranışta bulunan kişilerde yapılan araştırmalardan bahsettiniz. O kişilerde prefrontal kortekste prefrontal korteks fonksiyonunda artış olduğunu söylediniz. Prefrontal korteksle bu gelişmiş kişilik, yani personality, kişilik gelişimi arasında bir bağlantı kurabilir miyiz? Yani demek istediğim şu, bir kişi eğer prefrontal korteksi yoksa, sizin o kişiliğin en üst seviyesi olarak anlattığınız unity, self-awareness, yani farkındalık, onu yaşayamayacak mı? Teşekkür ederim.
We've done functional brain imaging studies that show that the correlation between the activation of the medial prefrontal cortex and self-directedness is correlated about 0.8. So it's a strong relationship. The other studies have looked at the preservation of gray matter in people that are more meditative and reflective and so on and creative. And this also is a strong relationship. The brain imaging studies with cooperativeness show activation in many parts of the brain correlated with cooperativeness. So all 7 of the dimensions of the TCI are related to individual differences in the activation of different parts of the brain. So these are strong relationships. The second part of your question I didn't understand.
Is there,
If someone, you said, is it possible to develop unity if it's not organized? So if I understand that correctly, does that sound right?
is there a relationship between the spirituality and the prefrontal cortex?
There's correlation shown in studies in Sweden between binding of certain serotonin receptors with prefrontal cortex and self-transcendence.
Actually, I asked that what if somebody doesn't has the prefrontal cortex or has prefrontal cortex dysfunction? Shall we say? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I get. That's what I thought you meant. If someone had a pervasive developmental disorder and some parts of the brain did not develop, then it may be irreversible because there just may not be a capacity for the development of new neurons, and you've passed some critical window. We know that there's always neurogenesis in the hippocampus, but that's only part of the self-awareness learning system. And so I think there may be some irreversible blockages. But if someone does have the capacity to be self-aware, what I've usually seen is just individual differences in the rate with which people can develop their character traits. And I think that the vast majority of people can transform their personality. Now, the way to do that, though, is not maybe the traditional psychotherapy that only involves talking, but it may involve exercises that require you to integrate the use of body and movement and thought and emotion. And there are a wide variety of these techniques that we're utilizing right now in our training for well-being coaches and coherence therapists. And it's not just talk. You have to learn to act. And what you do is also not sufficient, but it depends on your intention. And so it involves that whole motor where your outlook, your activity, and the brain are all then forming an interactive circuit.
Thank you very much Professor Cloninger. Alkışlıyoruz hocayı ve çok canlı bir tartışma oldu. Teşekkür ederiz.